This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Find show notes, links to subscribe, and leave Apple Podcast reviews by going to our website, beyondthebigscreen.com. And now, let's go beyond the big screen.
Here we are again. Chris and I are talking more Mafia, and we're diving further into the Bad Blood series, which lays out the life and times of Vito Rizzuto. Chris and I talked about Bad Blood, the first two episodes in last episode, and we're going to dive into some of the details of this really interesting show, a show that got so much right. And Chris and I we're always saying, oh, I wish there was a mini series made of a topic. And bingo, what do they do? Vito Rizzuto mini series. So for better or worse, we're going to talk about the better. We're going to talk about the worse. And I think the place we're going to start off with, at least for Chris, is some of the worst of this series. And one of the worst things that Chris mentioned to me, he sends me a furious text. I can't stand Vito's mistress. In the mob world, they would call that somebody's guma. Vito was married to a woman, a really prominent mafia woman from a prominent mafia family, but he had a mistress. That's what they did all the time. And the mistress, as she was portrayed in this CTV television series, Chris hated her. So maybe lay out your case. Why did you hate Vito's guma in this movie? Series, rather.
I just felt like she just adds absolutely nothing to this show at all. Like, she's just always whining, like, oh, I need Vito's attention. I need this. Like, do you not get it? Like, you're the mistress, right? Like, every time she's on screen, all I'm doing is saying, I was like, please get her off. And they don't really do anything with the character. Like, we'll get into it like later in the show. It's like maybe they had ideas that would have made her character a little bit interesting, but like, from the, so far that we've watched in the show, from this is going to be episodes 3 and 4. So from episode 1 to 4, she adds nothing, and she's just whiny, and she doesn't seem to like get it. And I mean, to be honest with you, like the story that they're generally telling, this might not sound like politically correct, but like, this is like, I don't know. It's like, this is a male driven story, right? And to be the women, at least in this part, like, if you want to get into like the actual deep dive of their like Rizzuto family history, like Libertina, who was Vito's mother, like, she was highly important, right? But from my research, I didn't know anything. I didn't hear anything about like Vito being in love with his mistress or anything of that sort.
I wanted to try and make a devil's advocate case for her, but it really, like you were saying, they set it up that maybe there's a point of conflict with her between Declan and Vito. Like, they almost set it up like Declan is going to have an affair with her, and that's during Declan's his little bit of a phase where he's like against Vito, but they never really carry that through. I think, like you said, if they wanted to bring women into this, Libertina would have absolutely have been way more interesting. Or the whole fact that, take Vito's actual wife, her son gets whacked, her father-in-law gets whacked. She's more than just in the mob. She's as much of the mafia as Vito is, that she's from this aristocratic, you might call it, mafia family. That's what's interesting. This side character that they built of Vito's Guma, that they don't even call her Guma. They don't make it out that no, you're the mistress. You're nobody really when it gets right down to it. I mean, that's in the mafia world. She could get dropped like a hat for nothing. And they really do set her up that she's something when she really is nothing. She was nothing to Declan. She was really nothing to Vito. And then they skip over all these opportunities to talk about Nick Sr.'s wife, to talk about Vito's wife. They miss all of that.
Yeah, it would have been much better if they had focused on like Vito's wife, right? And then we would have got the aspect of, seeing her son die too, right? And like her and Vito's relationship, and Niccolo Senior and Libertina would have been much better, because Libertina, I look her up. She was very important cog in this entire machine, right?
We probably won't get too much into it, but she was helping funnel money around Europe. Well, Big Nico was in jail in Venezuela. Like, there's a lot of stuff going on with her that she was direct. She was the mafia. Her father was a big deal in the mafia. All of her family, like, you can't take any of that away.
Yeah, I mean, the only interesting thing they could have done with the mistress character is, I don't know, maybe she ends up going with Declan and like betraying Vito, or maybe I shouldn't have said that, but you know what I mean? It's like, oh, not only did I betray you, I stole your woman too, right? Like, that would have been like, that would have made sense. And that would have been something to do with it.
That would have been it.
Yeah.
And that would have been really boring.
But I mean, like, they kind of hint at it where a little bit where she's like calling him like, oh, you got to take me out to the nightclub. And you know what I mean? There's some kind of tension, like maybe there is some kind of sexual tension there, but like they never do anything with it. I don't know. She just drives me insane.
And then she's screaming, oh, Vito, why don't you call me Vito? You're not his wife. And you can make any sort of feminist based arguments or whatever, but if we're looking at this from Vito Rizzuto's perspective, she's not his wife, and that's that. And maybe she was a liberated Canadian woman who didn't know what she was getting into. Maybe they could have explored it in that way, but that's not the way they explored it. She seemed to have understood that she was a mafia mistress. And I think it was stupid. And I think it really was a distraction from the fact that it was so important of the actual women who were Sicilian women who were absolutely connected in this story. But let's move on from that. People can judge us and judge her from that point. Let's talk about one of the major aspects of these two episodes, and it carries over into the previous two episodes, and it will carry over into this whole story, is how involved Vito and the Rizzuto clan was in the construction game in Montreal. Montreal was booming in the 80s, and every single construction project had Vito Rizzuto's thumbprints all over it.
Yeah, 100%. Like, basically the entire construction industry in Montreal for a very long time was infiltrated by the mob. Everyone was like paying each other off. And then in particular, the mob, the guy who kind of ran the whole thing, it was Andre Desjardins. And you would think, oh, is he related to Renard Desjardins from the previous episode? But there's no relation between the two. Andre pretty much ran this entire construction racketeering. Ironically enough, Mom Boucher, we're going to talk about him later, his dad actually worked under Andre Desjardins. Yeah, so like Renaud, he did get in construction later, like after he got out of jail. That's the slight, like the show, it's slightly different how they depict the direction he went into the show. It's not really that important, but he got involved in the construction too, right? But like Vito and the character Bruno, the way they depict it in the show is kind of, it's exactly how like construction racketeering goes on. And it's a really important part of the mob. Like people don't, it's one of these things that it doesn't jump out to you, like say prostitution, or that's not something the American mob was typically involved in, but like say drug trafficking or doing, you know, hits for hire. It's basically how like the mob like infiltrates like the construction industry. And then in essence doing this, they start infiltrating like the political system. Is basically the mob gets into the unions, right? And to do any of these kind of big construction projects, like building a bridge or building a house, and they do a good job of showing this on the show too, is there's only a couple construction companies, give or take, in an area that are actually capable of doing that job. Like there's lots of construction companies. There's just not lots of construction companies that can build condos, you know, like a massive multi-million-dollar condo building. As an example that they use in the show, but that was also real life too. The condo building that's getting built there is something that Rizzuto was involved in, and his son. So they get in with the unions, and to be able to build these types of buildings, you need union labor, right? If you can't get the union labor, you're not going to get the contract, right? So you have to give a kickback to the union bosses. You have to give a kickback to the mafia, and all this does in the long run is that it exponentially raises the cost of any construction job, from even simple things like fixing the roads to like building construction buildings, and from paying all these kickbacks too, right? Construction companies will look for shortcuts to try to make up for some of the losses they're having to make for doing these kickbacks. But, you know, you can take some, let's say we have like a project and it's estimated that it's going to be worth, I don't know, $250 million to build. By the time this entire construction racketeering process is done, you're looking at that building, maybe it's costing $500 million, $600 million, right? And that's taxpayers' dollars. That's why a lot of people, they look at the city construction and they go, oh my God, like how can it get so expensive? And this is one of the ways it happens.
And it really is a story almost as old as time. I mean, you could go back to the Romans and kickbacks for land, kickbacks for construction. But even in we'll be talking about this plenty with the Mafia in New York and the outfit in Chicago when they were building Las Vegas. It's anything that was touched in the building trades had to have the Mafia's. They had to get their kickback on it, or else it just didn't happen. I mean, they talk about I think it was New York City's City Hall, or maybe it was the New York City's Justice Building. And this is even before the Mafia, but with Tammany Hall, $200 windows, when a window, it should have cost about $10 in the 1800s. I mean, that's how bad it was. And you think about a place like Montreal or Toronto, even to this day, where they're, it's a city of cranes, just cranes bringing in stuff left or right for all these high rises, and union and mafia money are all over it.
Yeah, I mean, probably one of the most stark examples. This isn't in North America, but this is actually in Sicily. Is the sack of Palermo, or basically like this type of racketeering was just taken to the absolutely extreme. Where I mean, if you can see it in southern Italy now, it's just like thousands and thousands of shady constructed concrete cinder blocks, basically, like surrounded by beautiful landscape. But that's all the mafia, right? And they all got kickbacks from doing this stuff. And it's one of those things that people don't realize just how insidious it is. It really is one of the worst things that the mob does.
Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like Richard Lim's This American President and other great shows. Go to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more, and here is a quick word from our sponsors. Let's shift focus to the biker gangs. I think the biker gangs is something that maybe for the U.S. audience, the bikers always seem to be a little bit of periphery to the actual mafia and to organized crime. That maybe they have their own rackets, but it's not something that you're not going to see biker gang activity normally in your neighborhood. But holy smokes, this was a major thing up in Canada. Talk about how the bikers were portrayed in the show and what their real connection were to Vito Rizzuto.
Yeah, I don't know if people are aware, but up here in Canada, the Hells Angels are massive in Quebec. I mean, to this day, right? By like right now, as of right now, the Italian Mafia is having to pay tribute to the Hells Angels, which is, a complete 180 from what it was before, where the Hells Angels would have to pay tribute to, the Rizzutos and the Italian Mafia. It's absolutely massive up here. And the guy that really made it this way was Maurice Mom Boucher. Mom was his nickname that the other bikers gave him because he acted motherly around the other. It's a weird nickname for a Hells Angels member. Yeah. And if you see, take a look at this biker, criminal. Well, if you take a look at this guy too, like when he was at his heyday, the dude looks like a math teacher or something, like a grade 8 math teacher or what have you. You wouldn't think he was a Hells Angels member.
And what was his responsibility? Was he portrayed exactly in the show?
He's he's basically like I'm trying to remember the biker's name, but he's the biker with the long hair who's kind of like the leader. That's who Maurice Mom Boucher is. I mean, in the show, they don't go into a ton of detail with the bikers because, to be quite honest with you, it would be probably add another 10 episodes onto the show. Just because it's so complex and there's a huge biker war we're going to talk about. But I mean, for the most part, I think they do a pretty good job of like depicting them and the conflict, that the kind of like the simmering peace between the bikers and the Rizzuto family.
It's interesting. He was born on my birthday. I have a connection with Maurice Mom Boucher. He in the show they just show him kind of as the typical classical greasy biker guy, but he definitely seems to have way more of a depth of character in the real story than he's portrayed in the show as just kind of stock footage biker.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess I'll introduce talking about the Hells Angels and Maurice Mom Boucher, you have to talk about both in terms of Quebec. There's, so Maurice Mom Boucher, he was born to a family of 8. So his parents were quite busy.
Yeah.
They grew up in poverty, really. His dad actually, like I mentioned earlier, his dad worked in construction under Andre Desjardins. And this is something we forgot to mention with the construction earlier, but in Quebec at the time that I'm talking about, construction work, it's always been hard work. I do something similar for a living myself, but at this time it was really, really hard work, and it didn't pay very well because, I mean, the mafia was, and with help of the union bosses too, were, stealing from the workers, really. You pay your dues, and all of a sudden you went to go use something that the union offered, and there was no money there because the mafia had taken it. And then basically just Maurice grew up in an area of Quebec where just drugs, that type of corruption that I just talked about earlier, and violence was just part of everyday life, really. He obviously didn't do very well in school. From what I read, he dropped out in grade 9, so he didn't make it very far. And so once he drops out of school, apparently he gets, apparently this was a thing where you can get like permission to go work on a construction site. I guess if you had to, maybe you had to be a certain age, but if you had dropped out of school, or I don't know, I guess you could apply for permission. He worked at a construction site for about 2 weeks and got fired because he was doing too much drugs and was drunk all the time. Now, I don't know if anybody in the audience is very familiar working in construction sites and this type of blue collar work. It takes a lot to get fired in 2 weeks for drinking on the job. I know that's probably
especially back then too.
Especially back then, right? So that says a lot. And I mean, the kid, he's only, I don't know, just like coming out of grade 9, right? So it's crazy to think that 14, he was already 15 a drug addict.
Years old, yeah.
So like quickly, Maurice became a hopeless drug addict. He started doing like small time crimes and stuff like B&Es, robbing liquor stores, corner stores, stuff like that, right? So, I mean, he's just growing up in criminality pretty much from the moment that he was born up until the point that we're talking about. And he openly admitted at this time in his life too that he was addicted to, what was it? Meth, alcohol, LSD, and heroin. All at the same time. He was addicted to, which is, I didn't even know, like at the time that we're talking, I didn't even know meth was a thing, but apparently it was. In terms of like street meth. I know like meth has always been something that they've used in like for pharmaceutical stuff, right? But I didn't know people were actually smoking meth at the time.
Yeah, I guess the 80s, he was on the cutting edge of something there. I can give him that. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is one of the funnier stories about Maurice Montboucher and kind of like the history of the Hells Angels. So Maurice Montboucher, he robs a butcher store, right? And steals, what did I read? It was $138.28 or something like that, right? This is all he stole from this butcher shop, but he ends up getting charged for armed robbery because he had a gun on him, and he goes to jail for 40 months. Like, you know what I mean? Like you're reading this guy's story. It's like he gets kicked off a construction site for, after 2 weeks. He's a drug addict, high school dropout, can't even rob a butcher store correctly. And somehow this guy ends up getting it together and ends up leading the Hells Angels. I just thought that was a funny story.
I mean, you hear stories about that where sometimes somebody just gets the book thrown at them for no inexplicable reason. And, they'll do serious time, especially in Canada. You would never expect somebody for, even if it was armed robbery, to get the book thrown at them like that. But you just, a prosecutor gets a wild idea and just goes for it. And you turn somebody like this into a minor league criminal, brings him up to the pros.
Yeah. So he does his time. And then once he gets out of prison, he joins a biker gang called the SS. I'm not exaggerating. It's literally what you think it is. Like it's, wow. He actually has an SS tattoo on his arm. And basically what this gang would do, it's exactly what you would think it was. There was a bunch of kind of skinhead doofuses that went around like beating up immigrants and, I don't know, getting high on drugs and drinking.
Was that necessarily a big thing in Montreal? I mean, I kind of get the sense that is a thing amongst the biker gangs of white supremacy and that sort of thing. But was that a big thing? And I mean, we're not going to get too much into the bikers. And I don't think that the Italian Mafia ever had that kind of ideology.
No, nothing that I've read from. I mean, like, I don't know, it was Italians first, right? Or Sicilians first type thing, right? But I mean, the bikers, it's always been, I've just been recently been reading Hunter S. Thompson's book on the Hells Angels. And I mean, it's the Nazi iconography is always kind of, I don't know, it's always kind of been there, right? And maybe some of them take it more serious in terms of like, oh, they actually believe some of this stuff, or some of them just kind of use it because it's, I mean, it really is kind of like the ultimate sign of rebellion in a sense, right? Like, who's like America's greatest enemy? Oh, it was Hitler. You know what I mean, right? And a weird, from what I've read, in a weird kind of twisted logic, I kind of get it. You know, like it's what would be like the biggest, you know, middle finger to the society right now. You know, like the Ramones used to like wave around like Nazi flags and crap,
Oh, no
stuff
way.
like
I didn't
that.
know
You know.
that.
You know, like
That's
back in
crazy.
the 70s, right? Like it was a thing at the time. Kind of
Yeah,
like
I think also with the bikers, I mean, they definitely tapped into that. Some of them did tap into that whole idea of white supremacy and everything. But like you're saying, a lot of them were straight up, they were former military guys, even in World War II. I think that's where the Hells Angels came from. It's a whole strange scene with the Hells Angels. I think we'll have to get into bikers. I don't know if we'll get into them in this current series or not, but the whole thing with the outlaw motorcycle gangs, we're going to have to address at some point.
Yeah, for sure, because it is really a fascinating subject. I'll say though, like I don't know if the rules have changed now, but at the time that we're talking about, the Hells Angels did have a rule that there was no, you had to be white to be able to become a full patch member. You couldn't be black. So I don't know if that's the rule that was going on in Quebec. I don't know if that's an overarching rule in all the Hells Angels chapters, because the Hells Angels, it's a, I don't know, from my reading, it's a lot more kind of loose than say how the Five Families ran in New York.
Yeah, and the Hells Angels really worked hard to, at least on the surface level, change their how people viewed them, that they were a philanthropic organization and everything. And the Mafia, it's certainly never, if they ever tried, well, they did try that in a certain way. If you go back to Crazy Joe and the Italo-American Civil Defense League and all that, they tried to make it out like they were some sort of philanthropic organization, but the Hells Angels kind of got away with that they, you know, rode their bikes and collected gifts and stuff like that for kids, and, you know, kids with cancer and that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, it's something up that drives me nuts up here. I think it's almost like once, I mean, every 2 times a year or something, I'll have a freak out about the Hells Angels, or people are telling me one thing. I'm just like, I don't know what you guys are out of your minds. Like, I don't understand. Like the Hells Angels up here in Quebec exist for one reason and one reason only. That's to traffic drugs. Like that's and commit crimes. Like that's pretty much. They'll be like, oh, they opened a store, and it's just like, oh yeah, okay, just wait a couple of years at most, and then you'll be like, oh wait, yeah, that T-shirt shop was selling cocaine and heroin to teenagers out of the back. Like, I don't. Do you know what I mean? Like, it drives me absolutely bonkers that their PR campaign has worked so well.
What was their relationship, the Hells Angels, with Vito? How did this fit into Vito's entire ideation or idea of creating this gigantic sixth family and pushing drugs in Canada?
Well, it became like something that the Vito wasn't powerful enough to actually be able to take on the Hells Angels himself, right? The Italian Mafia just wasn't the case, right? And so, you know, to kind of fast forward quickly, Maurice Montboucher becomes the leader of the Hells Angels to a degree, and Well, actually, let's just backtrack for a little bit. There was an event called the Lennoxville Massacre, right? And there was 2 different chapters in the Hells Angels. There was the northern chapter and the southern chapter. And the northern chapter, if I'm remembering this correctly, had a huge problem with drugs, right? So they bring the drugs in, but they end up using a lot more than they were selling, right? And this caused a huge problem with the rest of the Hells Angels because it made them look bad and they were stealing off other bikers, and it was just unprofessional, right? I honestly will argue that probably this northern chapter is probably much closer to the truer original version of what the Hells Angels was supposed to be. But that's a little bit of a tangent. So the southern chapter arranges this massacre where they pretty much wipe out this entire northern chapter of the Hells Angels, right? And Maurice Montboucher, who was still in the SS at the time, he saw this and he was like super impressed. He's like, "Oh my God, like you guys wiped them all out." But he also had like 2 comments. He's like, "Well, you left 2 of them alive," right? So this is the type of individual that we're dealing with. He's psychotic, right? This was a big deal, and not just in Quebec. This was a big deal in all of the entire biker world, right? The Hells Angels killing other Hells Angels members is just something that didn't really happen. But this ended up leading to like a series where a bunch of mass arrests happened, and Maurice Montboucher he found himself in a situation where he could rise up relatively quickly in the Hells Angels. So that's how he ends up becoming kind of like the leader, right? It was also at this massacre that happened. This is something they don't really get into on the TV show, that Salvatore Cazzetta, who was in the SS biker group with Maurice Montboucher, he saw this and he's like, "I don't want anything to do with the Hells Angels. Bikers don't kill biker brothers, especially not like this." And he sets up his own biker gang called the Rock Machine. And these are the 2 biker gangs that end up going to war with one another in the big biker war in Quebec, which is kind of what's going on. And during the entire time that the Bad Blood TV show is going on, this and biker war is going on at the exact same time. And basically Maurice Montboucher, he leads the eternal enemy of the Hells Angels, are the Outlaws, which is another biker gang, and they were in Quebec. And Maurice Montboucher was probably one of the better soldiers in terms of slowly getting rid of the Outlaws in Quebec. And this is where he kind of makes his bones, and all the other Hells Angels, around the rest of the world take notice of him. And they're successful. They get rid of the outlaw biker gang, and basically that's at this point the only 2 biker gangs left are the Rock Machine and the Hells Angels, and the Rock Machine are significantly smaller. So Vito kind of has no choice he's kind of has to work with them to a degree, right? Because he's not powerful enough to go to war against them. And even if all the combined energies of, say, like the Rizzuto family and all the other different organized crime elements in Quebec decided that they were just going to take on the Hells Angels, I don't know. I don't even know if they could win or not. So in a lot of ways, they're basically equals.
Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors.
That was one of the things that was really surprising to me, is that Vito's crew was never that large. I think he had maybe 60 made men at his absolute peak. I mean, that's nothing compared to a family in New York or Chicago, one of the big 5 families. He never had that many guys to control the kind of territory that he did. So he really did need the bikers. He needed the Haitians. He needed the Irish gangs to to muscle this huge territory he was trying to control.
Yeah, and like you pointed out, it was never a really big crew, right? But Vito also tried to keep things really close knit. Too, he wasn't a big fan of like over expanding the family, like only people that he believed that he could trust without, with the 100%, right? So, but even like Vito ends up trying to expand himself too at one point, where he sees what's going on with the Hells Angels and he sees what's going on with the bikers. Because the Hells Angels ends up expanding into Ontario too. That's also another pet peeve of mine where people argue with me like, oh no, the Hells Angels have been here since like the 60s or the 70s. It's like, no, there was no Hells Angels in Ontario at one point, and the Banditos ended up coming up into Ontario, and the Hells Angels panicked and started going to all these other biker gangs and being like, oh, do you want to be a Hells Angels member? There's your patch. And Vito ends up trying to kind of do the same thing. He gets involved in Toronto, and he has this idea that he was going to unite all the Italian mafias and kind of create his own Italian mafia version of the Hells Angels, because he kind of saw the writing on the wall where it was going, that the Hells Angels was going to become the most powerful criminal organization in all of Canada.
Yeah, that's the thing I think we need to keep trying to get back to and re-impress, is that Montreal was really always an offshoot of one of the five families, the Bonanos, but it kind of went back and forth. But then Toronto and then Hamilton. Hamilton's a city that never gets a lot of credit in the US, but it's a huge city in Ontario. I think it's almost 1 million people, and it has a ton of industry. And, it's a typical classical Rust Belt city that had mafia, but it was kind of fought over by Buffalo. It was fought over by Detroit, and Toronto was really in the same place. Toronto is another one that it's a mega city now, but in the 60s and even into the 70s, it wasn't that influential, and it grew into the 70s and the 80s as it exploded. Then every mafia guy and their brother wanted to get involved in the drugs and the construction and everything that was going on there.
Yeah, Toronto and Hamilton areas been traditionally, the Buffalo family had massive, the Magadinos had like massive interest and influence in Toronto and the Southern Ontario region. As of right now, Southern Ontario is the Ndrangheta territory for the most part, which, if you remember, is the Calabrian Mafia. The Lapino, I believe it's the Lapino family, pretty much runs Hamilton. There's two different families in Toronto. I mean, there was a bunch of arrests actually not too long ago, I think within the last couple of years. And if you remember Paulo Violi from our previous episodes, this is where the rest of his family kind of ran, was in this Hamilton, Southern Ontario region. Me and you were just talking about another mobster in Buffalo, and I pointed out to it's like Violi, eh? Does that name sound familiar?
Yeah. All these names keep coming up, and this is stuff that's coming out in the news right now with the Buffalo family. We'll get into the, even though there's really not a show or a movie directly about the Buffalo family, but holy smokes, all of this stuff is, if we had on our wall, one of those maps with string. And all of this stuff is all linked together. And I think that's kind of maybe what we're trying to do with this whole Mafia series, is one thing leads to another. The Bonanos with the Rizzutos, with the Magadinos, and then loops all back into Appalachian. But let's go back in and let's tie up the story of the outlaw motorcycle gangs in this whole story of the Vito Rizzuto in Montreal.
Oh yeah, so Maurice Montboucher to set it up. So the war breaks out between the Rock Machine and the Maurice Montboucher and his Hell's Angels. Maurice didn't want to go after Salvatore while he was still alive. He ends up going to prison, and Maurice says, "Oh, this is my opportunity." And the way Maurice kind of looks at Quebec and kind of looks at his Hell's Angels, this is kind of what I think his goal was, is he looked at the cartels in Colombia, Mexico, and he understood like, oh, well, why were some of these cartels so powerful, right? Because in a lot of ways, they basically killed their entire competition, right? So Maurice sees this opportunity, was like, well, if I can get rid of the outlaw biker gangs and their allies, there's going to be nothing that stands in the way of the Hells Angels. I mean, the Rizzuto family, yes, but it's just a matter of time before they end up taking them over too, right? Or putting them underneath their thumb. And this is what happens. Like between 94, I'm trying to remember the dates right now. I believe it's 94 to looks like early 2000s or something like that. There's this massive biker war that's going on in Quebec at the time. And now we've talked about like mob wars in previous episodes, right? Where internal family squabbles. For the most part, they tried to keep it. And the American Mafia had like certain rules, like they wouldn't do car bombings. They would try to avoid civilian casualties as much as possible. This is when we get into the zips, we'll kind of show you how the Sicilians viewed a lot of this stuff differently. Where Maurice Montboucher, he didn't care, man. He would kill journalists. He would do car bombings where he knew pedestrians would get hurt. At one point, he was going after prison guards and going after police officers. And if he wasn't killing them, they were getting beaten up or their lives were being threatened. And the way he kind of ran the Hells Angels up here in Quebec is very similar to how you would expect a cartel to run in, say, Mexico or Colombia.
It's so very different in the American Mafia and even American organized crime in general. The whole idea of avoiding killing cops and killing prosecutors, killing judges. I mean, in so many other countries, that's just standard fare. Cops get killed, judges get killed. I mean, we look in Sicily, that happens all the time. In Colombia, I mean, they use them in Colombia and Brazil. They use the actual military to fight these cartels. And that's something that's very different flavor in the U.S., especially when we talk about the Italian mafia. I mean, they went in a lot of ways way out of their way to not kill a cop. And if a cop got killed, even a dirty one, if we look at go back to our episode with the Iceman, Richard Kuklinski, when he killed a cop, that was a big deal.
Yeah. And, but for even like, yeah, no, it's true, right? Like the American Mafia viewed a lot of this stuff very differently, but even the Hells Angels themselves are kind of more similar to, how the American Mafia looks. Like the American Hells Angels, what Maurice Montboucher was doing in Quebec was like way off the deep end. Were to the point where the American Hells Angels chapters were getting really angry at him because it was making them all look very bad too. And even like Rizzuto did a couple things that were kind of a little bit different than the American Mafia in terms of like just, the massive amounts of drug trafficking and what have you. But for the most part, he kind of held the American Mafia in line as he tried to limit as many outside casualties as possible and try to keep it within house. And, when they did arrest Vito Rizzuto, he did tell them, like, you guys don't know what you're doing. Like, it's going to be absolute chaos. Like, I'm the only one kind of keeping this together. And he wasn't lying. And if you look up Maurice Montboucher and his history, he's totally out left field.
This might be a good time to talk about this aspect, and I think it's a conversation we've certainly had a lot of times. Is somebody like Vito, because we have to kind of look at it that what's law enforcement trying to do? They're trying to make society safe and cut out the drugs. Is it better to have somebody like Vito Rizzuto running this operation where he's running it somewhat clean, that there's not a lot of outside killing, any violence is inside of the families? Or is it better that law enforcement bust up Vito Rizzuto and then everything falls apart and there's total chaos and there's all sorts of violence everywhere on the streets? You have to ask your question, is it better to have controlled chaos or just absolute chaos?
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors.
From going through the history of the Rizzuto family and reading about the biker wars, I would believe, it's preferable to have somebody like Rizzuto running the whole thing, really, as opposed to the Hells Angels. Or, the Hells Angels have cleaned up their act a fair amount because, I believe they've learned from their they've learned from their mistakes of what Maurice Montboucher did. Yeah, but in terms of like criminality, I would think it's preferable to have, like, say, the five families running it, or somebody like Vito Rizzuto, who are actively trying to, like, not involve the general public in their criminality.
Do you think that this is a tough question? Do you think that the Vito Rizzuto in particular, and maybe the Mafia in general, but we can't say that maybe absolutely in general, do you think that they really didn't want to sell drugs to kids and to teenagers, that they really just wanted to sell it to adults who were drug addicts, that they wanted to keep the drugs into the seedier elements of society, you might call it, or the Montbouchers? They kind of say it, the character in the movie or in the television series says that in my bar, I can sell drugs to a 10-year-old at my bar and nobody will say a word about it. And he seemed like he was totally cool with that. Do you think that Vito really didn't want drugs sold to children and to teenagers and out front of schools and that sort of thing? Or he just didn't care?
I think Vito, I honestly do think, like, the American Mafia, for the most part, tried to keep a clamp down. And I think Vito, too, did agree that, like, if you're going to you're selling junk, they're selling it in, like, certain neighborhoods, right? They didn't want to have it get involved in the general public. If you want to go use it, go ahead, right? Like, you can use heroin, is a slightly different story, but, like, you can use coke recreationally, I guess, right? Like, it's a New Year's Eve party or something, and you're not gonna become, like, addicted or anything to it. Where heroin's a different story, where there are stories of people, like, they do one hit and that's it. I think that one reason there was more money in coke, but I think that was one thing that I think the American Mafia kind of liked about coke, as opposed to heroin. Is a really dirty drug, and, like, the images of, like, the heroin junkies and stuff like that it's not nice, right? And it also grabs, like, people's attention. It's because it's very stark too. But I do think, for the most part, they tried to keep it out of. I don't think, like, I don't think these guys were, like, selling to, like, teenagers. You know what I mean? Like 13-year-olds and 14-year-olds. I really don't think they were doing that. I think they were selling to adults, or maybe 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, like, kids that are, like, older. Whereas the like you pointed out, the Maurice Montbouchers, they didn't give a damn. They didn't care. We're talking about the same guys that would, like, light off a they would set off a bomb, a car bomb, knowing that kids are going to be around, knowing that there's going to be collateral damage. They didn't care. The American Mafia for the most part, didn't do stuff like that.
Not really until the Zips got involved. and then it all changed. Let's talk about when Vito gets out of jail. What happened? Vito is put into jail, just to recap a little bit, on a charge in the US, and he's sent to the Supermax in Florence, Colorado, where you're buried. And that's something that I quibbled with, that they don't really portray that in the movie, where Vito's making deals with Declan, and Vito has guards inside of the prison of other prisoners who are looking out for him, and they're sharing each other's life stories. Like, that would not be happening in a Supermax. And that's the reason why they put Vito in a Supermax, is to bury him in a hole so that he couldn't be running his criminal organization. But eventually Vito did get out of jail. And what did that look like? Did he just roll back into being a boss of Montreal?
He gets out of jail and he lays low. And the TV show, it depicts him like going right back to Montreal, but that's not entirely how it happened. Like, he got out of jail, and from what I've read, he spent a little bit of time in New York, I guess, talking to other family members, and like Mafia members from the different families. And he stayed in Toronto for a bit. He actually had a specialty type of car made, so it was like a bomb-proof and bulletproof and the whole 9 yards.
Wow.
And he's like, in the TV show, it shows that he gets to Montreal and he lays low for a couple of months. So that actually did happen, just didn't happen in Montreal. And he was laying low in Quebec. In Toronto.
How does he eventually get back into the Montreal scene, and how does he reintegrate himself? Are people, you have people who have taken over in the show. It's Declan, but in the, you have Reynald Desjardins, you have the bikers, you have all these other groups who are vying for his power. Do they accept him as putting the crown back on his head?
Well, he shows back up. And in the Rizzuto organization, though, had been heavily damaged. It was still around, right? And Vito had obviously a lot of power still, and had a massive presence and wealth. And he steps back in, and we talked about this on the previous episode, right? Where like Vito just comes to the conclusion is he doesn't even really care about the money per se. Is he wants revenge for what happened while he was in prison, which is the death. His son was killed, and then so was his 89-year-old father was shot with a sniper, like with a rifle, like sniper rifle style.
Before we get into how Nico Sr. and Nico Jr. are whacked, let's talk. You brought up the character of Bruno Bonsignori. What was his story?
Oh yeah, so in the show he's kind of like depicted in the show. These are the type of guys. He's like the white collar criminal in the Rizzuto organization. And the Mafia always has these like types of guys around that are they're really good earners, but like you scratch a little bit below the surface, and like these guys aren't mafioso, right? Like they're not gonna, they get scared when guns go off. Like they're not gonna kill anybody or anything like that. It's almost I don't know. It's almost like these I don't know. It's almost like these guys. I don't know. They're not really mafia, but they're useful, right? Because they can, I don't know, they have certain ends with politicians, they have certain ends in the construction industry, they're good with business, but when it comes to brass tacks, they really shouldn't be involved in any of this because they're just not cut out for it.
Was he more or less the person portrayed by Enrico Colatani. He's a famous Canadian actor. He's been in a million things. He was the consigliere who kind of played off of Declan.
Yeah. Or, yeah, I would say so. Yeah, for the most part, I think they did a pretty good job.
Was he eventually whacked like in the show?
No, it's slightly different. Like Vito doesn't kill him.
Yeah, right there in the middle of his birthday party.
No, there was a couple. If I'm remembering correctly, there was a couple attempts on his life, and I think it was not that long ago. Eventually, I mean, in terms of like not super long ago, but eventually they ended up people ended up getting him.
This is probably the good time. We'll wrap up for today, and we'll talk about the death of Vito's father and his son, both named Nico. Nico Sr., Nico Jr. Nico Jr. gets it first. Set up his ultimate demise.
Yeah, in the TV show, he was basically forced to stop trying to run the organization because he was doing such a bad job at it and was pissing everybody off. And they set up in the show that he's always kind of been wanting to be his dad. He wants to kind of take over the family, but he's not cut out for the type of life. He's not mafia. He's not mafioso. So he wasn't really raised around it because Vito didn't really want him to be part of that life. In the TV show, it's depicted that he's walking his dog and people drive up and, drop a couple clips into him. And yeah, that's it.
And what happens in real life? Is that fairly accurate that he just drove by and popped and that was that?
Yeah, it's slightly different. I believe he was coming out of, because I was looking up articles at the time that it was actually happened. And it's interesting to read because these articles are not that long ago, right? A lot of the stuff is pretty recent history. Yeah, he was walking out of basically like a business building, and people just came up in a car and shot him. That was it.
And then Nick Sr., who had a crazy life himself, and we've touched upon this. He spent time in Venezuela, time in jail in Venezuela, and he's really the one who set up all of this. He winds up getting whacked in a really unusual circumstance. How was Nick Sr. killed?
Yes. Yeah. So Nick Jr. and then a couple months. It seems like in the TV show, it happens like one right after the other.
Yeah.
But there's a couple months gap in actuality, like how it actually happened. And yeah, he was having in the show, it shows that he was like picking tomatoes for dinner because he has like tomato plants in the house, but he was actually just sitting having dinner with his family, and there was a rifle shot that went through the window like it shows in the show, and he was killed.
That's a bold way to kill someone. It's not an easy shot. Through a suburban neighborhood, finding a place to get a good shot and then to shoot through a window to make sure you hit somebody. I mean, you're taking a lot of chances that you could hit an innocent bystander. Was that usual? Was that a normal way that the mafia was killing people then?
No, none of this is normal, really. Like, especially around his family, that for the most part, most mafia history, that's just no, you just didn't do that. Even killing other family members, I know it might sound a little weird, but for the most part, the American mafia didn't go after sons, and Nick Sr. is a little bit different because I guess technically he would have been the head of the Rizzuto family at the time, with Vito being in jail. So, and he had been mafia his entire time, but the dude was 89 years old. Like, that's, you know what I mean? Like, the mafia usually didn't do stuff like that. And it shows escalation of sorts where a lot of the kind of like the old rules, how things used to run were just I don't thrown out the window in this particular circumstance.
That seemed like a real zip thing to do too, where they would shotgun somebody right in front of their wife. If that was a good place to go and get them, then they would, blast the person right in front of their wife or in front of their kids, or old school stuff, and not something that was necessarily in the DNA of the American mafia.
Yeah, and in some way, I mean, there's different theories about who killed Nick Jr. and Nick Sr. I personally think the Andromeda in Southern Ontario had something to do with it. That's my personal opinion. And a lot of those guys, those organizations in Southern Ontario, they have guys coming, straight from Calabria, and it's a totally different world over there in terms of how they do things than what the American mafia would typically do.
Yeah, they really were. They were a parallel mafia. They were really, it's the old school. I think when you think of it, it's the old school. It's the way these clan-based societies work, where it's a family and they really will kill women and children and family members, and they have no compunction over doing that. And that was something that kind of got Americanized out of the American mafia.
Yeah, I mean, and like the Sicilian mafia, there's like a famous story about them killing, I believe it was like a 12-year-old boy or something like that, like holding him hostage and torturing him, which is just crazy. Like the American mafia didn't do stuff like that. I mean, they were ruthless, but they were usually ruthless to like other mafioso, not women and children.
I think that that's in a way that how so many people could be rats. Even Joe Valachi, way back in the 60s, he must have known somewhere deep inside that nobody was going to take his wife and his kid hostage and torture them. Like what would have happened with the Ndrangheta or the Sicilian mafia, or heck, the cartels or the Albanians or any number of organized crime outfits throughout this world, that if you had ratted out, your family's fair game.
Well, you had mentioned earlier the book, Confessions of the Andrew Scopa book.
Yeah.
Confessions of a Mafia Man, or I'm trying to remember the title. But like Andrew Scopa talks about how all the rules are changing, and at the time, because he becomes like the new Vito Rizzuto to a degree, like he ends up kind of running the Montreal Mafia for a bit. But he does mention how like all these guys are ratting and all these people are talking, like how come like they get to see their families and kids and I don't, I have to go to prison, and it definitely does change where the mafia, they're openly, because they have them on tape and stuff like that, openly talking about like, we gotta up the ante here. Like if you're a rat, like that's it, we're going after your family and kids. Like we're like the Sicilian, I guess the more hardcore version of the mafia is like slowly starting to come into Canada and the United States. I mean, because I get it to a degree, right? Like, I mean, they somewhat have a point. Like, well, I mean, why does the rat get to, live his life and with his wife and kids and be free? And then after enjoying all the profits of living this type of lifestyle, and then you're the one that has to go to jail for the next 40 plus years, or potentially get the death penalty. I mean, it's only happened one time where a mafia guy got the death penalty, but I mean, it's still on the table.
Yeah, absolutely. To wrap up today, let's talk about, I think maybe try and humanize this a little bit. After all your reading about Vito Rizzuto, how do you think it affected him personally that within such a short amount of time, his son and his grandfather, or his father, his son's grandfather, but Vito's father, Nico Sr., and then his son, Nico Jr., get whacked out? How do you think that affected him personally? In the show, they said he almost seems like a defeated man, like he's physically deflated. How do you think that impacted him personally in real life?
Well, and on top of it, like in real life, like his brother-in-law was like kidnapped, and then like, they never found him. They still haven't found him. I mean, you could like, I can only imagine, like, you put in all this work your entire life to set up this system that's running smoothly. Everyone's making money. You know, you've helped out all these, you've helped out the Hells Angels, you've helped out the street gangs. It's all running perfectly. And the second that you go to jail, it all completely falls apart. Everyone's turning on you the second that it happens, and then they kill your family. I can only, like, you would feel despair and be like, what's the point of all of this? I personally, but I also think he was enraged. He was pissed off. Like, he was only gone for a couple of years, really, and it just all went to complete garbage. And it's almost like when you show up to work after like going on vacation. I know like this example might not fit it perfectly, but like you go on vacation, then you come back to work and it's just like, what did you guys do for the last 2 weeks? You know, you come back and it's a mess, right? Like there must have been that sense of that kind of feeling, but like, you know, multiplied by a million.
Yeah, that's a great analogy, is that when you show up and everything is a nightmare, and it really should have never been. You busted your hump for the week before you went on vacation to make sure everything was going to go smoothly. And then you just come back and it's like the floor's falling out. And that must have been what it was like for Vito, is where do I start to pick up all this mess that's been created?
Yeah, you know, and it's like you come back and and Vito, he's like, I don't even think he was really interested in fixing the mess, because as I pointed out earlier, like he could have fixed the mess, I guess, right? But so why? All these people that said they were loyal to you, and all these people that you made money for and treated well in terms of, you know, the criminal underworld, they all turned on you the second that they could. The second that things got rough for you, they all, you know, betrayed you. Why would you even? There's a part of me, I wouldn't even want to fix it. I would just want revenge. Like, you killed my son and my 89-year-old dad. 89. He was going to die any minute.
All right. Well, that's where we're going to leave it today. We still have 2 more episodes of the Bad Blood series to talk about. If there's other movies you'd like for us to talk about, other aspects of the Mafia, we're not even close to done with this series, because like I said, once you start pulling on a thread of this sweater, it just keeps unraveling. And I think we're going to keep following up as long as we're interested in it, and as long as you're interested in it. But if there's something specifically with the Mafia or anything else that you would like us to talk about, definitely send in your emails and we will talk to you next time.